Greetings. So I was looking at this YouTube community post by Dante Fortson, which he put out yesterday, which is addressed apparently to Berean TV, or at least has Berean TV as the central subject. And the YouTube community post has this very friendly message which reads, "Thank you for being a scumbag." With scumbag being apparently it's Dante's favorite pejorative. He refers to just about every person that's ever criticized him as a quote-unquote scumbag. Pardon my language. Whatever the case, I'd like to read through the post real quick and then discuss it a bit, because I think it provides us with an opportunity to explore Dante's reasoning, or the lacunae in his reasoning. Okay, so the post reads as follows, quote, "Why hasn't Berean TV addressed the elephant in the room? Common sense would tell anyone with a brain that somebody is lying, and the people lying are the people trying to sell you an Israel inconsistent with what the Bible made it clear they look like." And then he provides some biblical quotes. Quote, "And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning in the floor of Atad, they said, 'This is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians, wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim,' which is beyond Jordan." This is Genesis 50:11, in reference to all of Israel's appearance when mourning Jacob's death. Next quote, "And they said, 'An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us, and watered the flock.' Exodus 2:19, in reference to Moses' appearance." Next quote, "Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar, and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" Acts 21:38, in reference to Paul's appearance. And so Dante comments as follows, "These people need to explain how they can tell the difference between an Israelite and a Hamite, when people living in the time couldn't even tell the difference. The truth is, they just want to be the biggest scumbags they can be towards black people that don't accept their clearly false narrative. They do not love their neighbors as themselves, as Christ said they should." And then he ends with, "Shout out to all of the true believers that have seen their behavior and walked away from these people based solely on that alone. Unless they start behaving like decent human beings, their numbers will keep declining, and we all know that the quote-unquote Christians acting like decent human beings is never going to happen." End quote. So that's Dante's post. It's a bit bizarre because, as I said, it opens as being addressed to Berean TV, but then when you see these statements that make claims about how certain people want to be, quote-unquote, the biggest scumbags they can towards black people that don't accept their clearly false narrative, I find it hard to believe that he includes Berean in that. That seems pretty strange. But again, Dante doesn't always engage in the clearest writing, so I would say he's invited to clarify what precisely he's referring to. In the meantime, I'd like to explore this whole point about, he feels that the ancient Israelites look like the ancient Egyptians, and therefore this is supposed to be indicative of, knowing who the Israelites today are, right? That's apparently his argument. It's not explicit, but that seems to be his argument. So I'd like to explore that a bit in this very short video, briefly explore that. Now, I want to open with a bit of a rule of thumb, and it's one that I've presented to Dante on a few previous occasions in our attempted correspondences, or my attempts to correspond with him on Facebook. And that is, clear writing requires clear thinking. At this point, Dante's argument is somewhat vague. We have to sort of infer it from, the vagaries of his statement. We have to attempt to read between the lines, and his reasoning raises a number of questions. Now, admittedly, we're not necessarily writing at this point, or we're speaking, so maybe we could say clear speaking requires clear thinking. But whatever the case, the point is that Dante's line of reasoning is somewhat foggy at this point. The central question, I think, is this: how does Dante define Israelite? Or if you like, we could change it to, how does Dante define who is or is not a Jew? Dante Fortson's definition of Israelite is unclear at this point, and I've asked him several times on Facebook to clarify how he determines who is or is not an Israelite, or what makes a person an Israelite. For example, consider this question: does Dante accept or deny the possibility of conversion? This is an important question because if conversion is possible, if someone who does not descend from Jacob can convert to the faith of Israel and become a member of the nation of Israel, then, trying to get into the morphology of Israelites would be irrelevant. It doesn't, if conversion is a possibility, then morphology tells us nothing about whether or not one is an Israelite, right? It tells us nothing about whether or not one is a Jew. However, if he wants to deny the possibility of conversion, it does beg the question: based on what? Are there biblical texts which he would appeal to? Because it seems like verses like, for example, Esther 8:17 seems to clearly refer to people converting and becoming Jews. Ruth, the central figure of the book of Ruth, could easily be described as a convert as well. But whatever the case, suppose, again, I'm not trying to press any particular position. I just want to know what Dante's position actually is. It's quite unclear. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that he does not accept conversion. Let's explore that possibility while we wait for him to clarify. That raises another question. Does Dante define Israelite strictly according to paternal lineage? Now, this is an important question because a lot of people who define themselves as Israelites today, for example, most one-Westers, or seemingly all one-Westers, almost all one-Westers, will have a very clear definition of Israelite, where you are whatever your father is. If your paternal line goes back to Jacob, you're an Israelite. If it doesn't, then you're not. And it doesn't matter who your mother was, or who your mother's mother was, or who your father's mother was. All the women of your lineage are irrelevant. The only thing that matters is your paternal line, your patrilineal descent. Does it go back to Jacob or not? That's the position of many Israelites, but it's not the position of all Israelites. And so it begs a question. Does Dante hold to this position? Does he limit the definition of Israelite to just paternal lineage, or does he factor in other lines of lineage as well? And, I've conversed with certain people who tried to claim like, oh, no, Dante definitely just pins it on paternal lineage. But he's put up Facebook posts where he's done this a couple of times, where he'll link to that Live Science article titled "Surprise, Ashkenazi Jews are genetically European." When you look at the article is talking about maternal lines. And so, there's only two possibilities. Either Dante Fortson sees your maternal line as relevant to whether or not you're an Israelite, or Dante Fortson didn't read the article that he's posted several times. I don't know, but it does beg the question. Hopefully he can clarify that as well. Why did he appeal to that article? Did he not read it carefully enough, or does he consider maternal lines essential to the definition of Israelite? And by the way, it begs the question that if your maternal line is also essential to the definition of Israelite, it would beg the question, for example, Ruth. We mentioned Ruth before. Was Ruth an Israelite? And if not, was her son that she had with an Israelite? Was the son of Ruth an Israelite? And if not, think about what this might eventually say about King David if you start knocking out members of his lineage and saying they're not an Israelite and therefore their offspring isn't an Israelite, and so on down the line. So again, Dante Fortson is invited to clarify his position on what makes a person an Israelite. And by the way, if I can say this really quickly, he has close ties. Dante has close ties to Jacoba of the End of the World Ministries. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily means he agrees with every position that Jacoba has taken, but it's worth noting that he might agree with Jacoba on an interesting position that Jacoba has taken. Jacoba has taken the position that a person can have the paternal haplogroup, the Y DNA or Y chromosomal haplogroup, E1B1A, which is very common amongst the West African diaspora and the Americas. And he takes the position that you could have that haplogroup and not be an Israelite, which is interesting because it begs the question, does Jacoba believe that you can descend from Jacob paternally and not be an Israelite? Because Jacoba's whole argument was that if a person has that haplogroup and they're quote-unquote white, they're morphologically white, then they're not an Israelite. That's interesting. So it does beg the question, where does Dante stand on that? Does he believe that being an Israelite is strictly based on appearance, based on morphology? And by the way, let me show you what Jacoba said in this regard. It came up in a discussion on Vocab Malone's channel on DNA. Here, listen to this and then we'll come back.
All right, here we go.
Minister, tell you, according to this particular guy, he lives his life as a white guy. His I'm assuming autosomal numbers are 97.5% European composition, 2.3% sub-Saharan, but yet his haplogroup is E1B1A. Now, according to Ron Dalton and the line that is a coward, isn't E1B1A supposed to be Israel? Well, what they're going to say is, well, he had black in his family. As you see, they're free colored persons. Yes, they are. But if he's 97.5%, that's more than most of us. If you go test your DNA being African, he's 97.5% European, makes him European. So therefore, according to Ron Dalton and according to the line that is a coward, this guy would have to be an Israelite. Minister Ted.
Now, let me know if I break up. But that shows you the faulty reasoning that they have, which is what we've been trying to show you guys for quite some time now.
You're breaking up.
Okay, well, hopefully it'll adjust, right? But we've been trying to show you guys this problem that they have with this logic about how they use E1B1A. Basically, they're saying anyone with E1B1A is Israel. So by their logic, this 97.5% European is Israel. Now, if you put that in jet match, you're going to see nothing but European, almost 90, you'll see 97.5% Europeans popping up as his match. Pop, 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 right? 97.5% Europeans will be coming up on his result set. Okay? 2.5% will come up as African. But yet they're going to say he Israel because E1B1A is the Israelites. That does not work.
Okay, is that it? That's it, right?
Yeah, that.
Okay.
What's weird about that is like, it's not like in the context of a debate where someone's pressing them like a hypothetical question or something. They're actually bringing this up, pushing this themselves.
Yeah, they're using it as an argument against Ron Dalton's position, right?
Wait,
and so
who are they referring to saying the liar that is
I don't know.
coward?
I think it was somebody that was on. I don't know for certain, but I think they were referring to someone who was maybe on a show with Ron Dalton, and I think they're making fun of his screen name. I don't know for certain. I don't know.
So
who
they're just straight up
to,
saying the lion who was a coward. They're just straight up calling him that the whole time.
Yeah, I assume it's a play on name. I don't know who they're referring to. But if let's say the gentleman's name was the Mighty Lion, hypothetically speaking, they would, something like that. I don't know who they were. But the gist of that is, so they're saying, Ron Dalton takes this position, if you have this marker, right, you have this paternal marker, then you're an Israelite, right? Now, they're saying, well, that can't be possible because, we found this guy out here. There's an article about him. He has that paternal marker, but most of his, ancestry is European, and he's morphologically white. Like he would fit your stereotype of a quote-unquote white person based on his outward appearance. So therefore, he can't be an Israelite. Now, think about the implications of this. What they seem to be saying, or at least is the implication. Let's suppose we went into this guy's lineage and, 20, 30 generations back, his father's line goes back to a descendant of a victim of the transatlantic slave trade, right? Let's say, hypothetically speaking, working within their paradigm, within the paradigm of both Ron Dalton and the Teo Ministries, let's assume that if you go back in this guy's line, you're going to find an Israelite.
On the Y side.
Line.
Okay.
Yes, on his father's line.
Yeah.
And that Israelite has a son with a quote-unquote white woman, a quote-unquote white non-Israelite, right? Then their son, has another son with yet another quote-unquote white woman who's not an Israelite. Then that child, and so on and so on. Each son keeps having a son with
30,
a woman who
30 generations of white women.
Yeah, and so as a result, you get this guy who fits their stereotype of a white person, but his paternal line, hypothetically speaking, goes back to an Israelite. What they're basically saying, what they're insinuating, is that you can descend paternally from Jacob and not be an Israelite based on your morphology, based on your outward appearance. And I think that's important because it shows how starkly different that is from like the standard One West position. Because for them to make a big deal about what his other lines are, aside from his paternal line, the implication is you can have a descendant of Jacob, a paternal descendant of Jacob. His father's father goes all the way back to Jacob, but he's not an Israelite because he's, quote unquote white. His skin is too light, his hair is too straight, etc., because of the women in his family.
This almost makes the One West position superior.
Okay, so as I was saying, I have no idea if Dante agrees with that or not. Hopefully Dante will clarify, but I do get the impression that Jacoba and Dante seem to think of the definition of Israelite strictly in terms of morphology, strictly in terms of color, and not actually in terms of lineage. So it begs the question, how do you define who is and is not an Israelite? Their definition of Israelite is important because if they don't define it, then we can't have a serious discussion about who is and who is not an Israelite. Yet he's challenging people to address that question, you know? And that's why I said clear thinking requires, clear writing requires clear thinking. Clear speaking requires clear thinking. So, if he's not clear on his definition, then we can't have a clear and, meaningful discussion on this subject, and he shouldn't bother inviting people to discuss it. However, if Dante does hold that strictly paternal lineage determines who is and is not an Israelite, then what that would mean is that morphology is irrelevant. You could look different from a paternal ancestor a generation of behind you, i.e. you can look very different from your father, much less your grandfather or your great-grandfather, much less a paternal ancestor that you had 100 generations back or 150 generations back. For an easy example, think of the very popular American music star Lenny Kravitz. Is Lenny Kravitz an Israelite? How do you know? If you didn't know his lineage, would certain Hebrew Israelites assume he was an Israelite? And that begs the question, was Lenny Kravitz's father, Cy Kravitz, an Israelite? Again, how do you know? If it's based purely on paternal lineage, then the example of Lenny Kravitz and Cy Kravitz shows that you cannot infer a person's lineage across millennia based on their morphology. It becomes ridiculous for someone to say, oh, based on how Lenny Kravitz looks, he's an Israelite. And then you meet his father and you go, oh, no, based on how Lenny Kravitz's father looks, neither one of them are Israelites. But then if you can have such a drastic change in morphology, then who knows what Cy Kravitz's paternal ancestors look like 5 generations ago, 10 generations ago, 20 generations ago, and so on. It's preposterous. And regarding this whole situation with Egyptians, there's a recent article, well, excuse me, it's not recent, it's actually from 2017, but there was an article on Nature, so it's on the website of Nature, nature.com, and I'll share a link in the video description. It's an article titled Ancient Egyptian Mummy Genomes Suggest an Increase of Sub-Saharan African Ancestry in Post-Roman Periods. The only reason why I bring this up is because if Dante and his supporters do limit Israelite identity to questions of paternal lineage, then it raises that we can talk, and that this whole attempt to appeal to Egyptians becomes more complex because Egyptians also had a number of different paternal lineages within their population. And this article is about genetic testing which was done on ancient Egyptian mummies. And it's an interesting subject. I just want to highlight this one portion right here, which reads as follows. And it says, Y chromosome haplogroups of the 3 individuals for which genome-wide data was obtained, 2 of which could be assigned to the Middle Eastern haplogroup J, and 1 to haplogroup E1B1B1, common in North Africa, end quote. Now, this is relevant because it shows that ancient Egyptians, first off, were diverse. Modern Jews are diverse, modern Egyptians are diverse, and ancient Egyptians were diverse. Different ancient Egyptians, different mummies are showing different haplogroups, different lineages. Now, I've mentioned before, and Dante should be familiar with my position, I'm not claiming that Ashkenazi Jews all descend from Jacob. I wouldn't even claim that most of them do. But it's worth noting that mainstream Jews, including Ashkenazi Jews, run across a spectrum of lineages, right? And there are literally millions of Ashkenazi Jews who have the paternal haplogroup J. And there are also many, many Ashkenazi Jews who have the paternal haplogroup E1B1B. So, there were ancient Egyptians who had close, relatively close, common male ancestors with some present-day Ashkenazi Jews. And so, too, there were other ancient Egyptians who had common ancestors, common paternal ancestors with some present-day Ashkenazi Jews, i.e., an ancient Egyptian who had the paternal haplogroup E1B1B is closer paternally to a modern Ashkenazi Jew who has that haplogroup than either of them would be to an ancient Egyptian who had haplogroup J or a modern Ashkenazi who had haplogroup J. And by the way, as I've covered in my video on DNA, this is also the case when you compare Ashkenazi Jews to Ethiopians. You find that a certain percentage of Ashkenazi Jews will have J, a certain percentage of Ethiopians, modern Ethiopians, will have J. A certain percentage of modern Ethiopians will have haplogroup E1B1B, and so too a certain percentage of Ashkenazi Jews will have haplogroup E1B1B. Now, these are populations that look rather different, yet they share a common paternal ancestor, a relatively recent common paternal ancestor. That's what you can infer from them having the same haplogroup. And what that means is that you can't infer a person's paternal lineage across millennia from their morphology, from their outward appearance, because you can have a situation where certain Ashkenazi Jews and certain Ethiopians look quite different, yet they're more closely related to each other than they are to other Ashkenazi Jews or certain other Ethiopians who look the same as one side or the other, or look similar to one side or the other. Again, so the point is, you cannot infer paternal lineage across millennia from appearance, from morphology. And that's something to keep in mind, because Dante seems to think almost strictly in terms of morphology, outward appearance. But again, how feasible his position might be depends on how he defines who is an Israelite. But let's explore this Ethiopian question. I really don't like getting into trying to say who is quote-unquote black and who's not quote-unquote black, because honestly, these terms are not clearly defined. I also don't like trying to look at, images and try to say this person is black or that person is not black, because the truth of the matter is that while people throw these terms around, they are not clearly defined. The contours of the population that is known as quote-unquote black, or the contours of the group of human beings who are quote-unquote not black, the borders are poorly defined. And the way to think of this is like this. Is Mariah Carey black? Is Wentworth Miller black? Is the current king of Morocco black? I think some Americans would say yes. Others would say no. In the case of the king of Morocco, some would say clearly yes. Now, I'm not making any claims about what the ancient Israelites look like or didn't look like. I'm not putting forth a denial that ancient Israelites being quote-unquote black or meeting Americans' notions of black. Nor am I claiming that any particular person today who fits some designation of black is not an Israelite, okay? But the reason why I went on that series of disclaimers, because if we're going to talk about what ancient Egyptians look like, the reality is that modern Egyptians run across a spectrum of looks. So too do modern Jews. And there is overlap between modern Egyptian morphologies. There's the spectrum of modern Egyptian morphologies and the spectrum of modern Jewish morphologies. Now, someone could say, oh, well, that's because, Turks somehow, infiltrated both the Egyptian and Jewish populations, whatever. But when we look at ancient imagery, I'm not going to make any claims about who is or is not black. But what I am going to say is that ancient Egyptian depictions also show a variety of different looks, many of which overlap with looks that we find in modern Egypt today. And that's why I have this book on the screen, Egyptian Art in the Age of the Pyramids. It was put out by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So what I'd like to do is just show a few of the images from this book, Ancient Egyptian Depictions of Ancient Egyptians. And again, I want to make clear that I'm not claiming that the spectrum of morphologies in ancient Egypt were limited to the images that you're seeing here. But I'm just giving these examples as some examples of showing that some ancient Egyptians had morphologies which are now typical in modern Egypt. The looks overlap. Some ancient Egyptians look like some modern Egyptians. Both populations were diverse. And I think you can infer that from the article that I just showed from Nature, which got into the fact that there were a number of lineages. Think of it this way. Egypt was essentially an empire. When you have a mighty, powerful dynasty or multiple dynasties, when you have this major power center, it becomes cosmopolitan because it's going to pull people from all over the region, pull people from the north, from the east, from the west, from the south. And so you're going to get a variety of people in a center like that, a center of power. Some people are coming for economic opportunities, others are being brought there forcibly. Okay, but the point is that ancient Egyptian depictions show a variety of looks, and there is overlap. The spectrum of ancient Egyptian morphologies overlap with the spectrum of modern Egyptian morphologies. So, if one is going to say that, ancient Jews had to have looked like ancient Egyptians, okay, but there were a variety of looks amongst ancient Egyptians, and so too today, some modern Jews look like some modern Egyptians. The same sort of patterns that we see now could have existed in antiquity as well. And, for example, the pharaoh Ramesses II, I find it hard to believe that someone would say with a straight face that it's impossible that he had a look for him to have had a look that would be typical of Egyptians today. Now, again, I'm not saying all ancient Egyptians look like the pharaoh Ramesses, but my point is there was a spectrum of morphologies in Egypt, and they overlap with what we see in modern Egypt today. And since Dante brought up Paul and the book of Acts, that allows us to talk about how Egyptians looked in the first century. And for that, we can go to the Fayum mummy portraits. Again, I am not claiming that the look of ancient Egyptians in the first century was limited to what you see here. I'm merely showing this to show that what existed in ancient Egypt in the first century included these morphologies. This is part of the spectrum of looks that existed in ancient Egypt. And so if one is going to say, oh, well, Paul had to have looked like an Egyptian, what does that mean? I mean, that means Paul could have looked like this. And moreover, this again tells us absolutely nothing about the lineages of any particular person today, right? You can't point to a person and say, oh, he looks different from what I saw in the Fayum mummy portraits, therefore he cannot descend from somebody who looked like what we see in the Fayum mummy portraits. That's bad reasoning. But more to the point, since, you know, bringing up specifically the lightning rod of Ashkenazi Jews, right? If ancient Jews look like what you see in the Fayum mummy portraits, right? If ancient Jewish morphologies mirrored what we find in the Fayum mummy portraits, there's nothing absurd about a people who look like that going into Europe and living for centuries in Europe and producing offspring that look like this. And I'm just being playful here. That's actually the actor Adam Sandler in his high school yearbook photo. But, I mean, all jokes aside, again, you know, if ancient Israelites could look like this and they spent centuries in Europe, there's nothing absurd about them winding up looking like this. So there is nothing absurd about at least some Ashkenazi Jews descending from people who look like whatever ancient Egyptians look like. And I think that's supported by the genetic evidence, and it's supported by simple logic as well. But beyond all that, you know, a lot of this was talking about morphology and, you know, conversion and definition of Israelite. A lot of that worked sort of tacitly within the paradigm of the Old Testament. Dante Fortson affirms the New Testament, so that raises even more questions about how we define Israelite. For example, this gets us into the sticky territory of quote-unquote replacement theology, spooky replacement theology. But I would love to know, and I've tried to correspond with Dante on this, but he didn't offer any meaningful response. But I would love to know, what does Dante think Romans 2:28 and 29 mean? You know, what does he think Romans 9:6 refers to? What does Ephesians 2:12 to 19 refer to? Because, you know, that text seems to clearly refer to people who are outside of the politeas of Israel, of the citizenship of Israel, the citizenry of Israel. And yet, with Christ, they become sympolitai. They become fellow citizens of what? Apparently of Israel. And then somewhat more, I don't want to say esoteric, but in a more allegorical or indirect sense, you know, in territory that's less literal, there's still the question of, is the tree, the quote-unquote tree in Romans 11 Israel? What's Dante's position on that? How about the woman, the quote-unquote woman who's discussed in Revelation 12? Is that a symbol of Israel? What does this refer to? How you answer these questions is going to have a dramatic impact on how you define who is and is not an Israelite, and likely it's going to have it's going to draw one into the conclusion that morphology is irrelevant, that you cannot define who is an Israelite based on how they look. But whatever the case, I look forward, I hope that Dante will answer these different questions, because the central question is, how does Dante define Israelite? If he wants to have a serious discussion about the Israelites, he's invited to address that question. You know, give a clear definition of Israelite. Is it based on paternal lineage? Is it based on maternal lineage? Do you accept conversion? All of these are important questions. And if he does not have a clear definition of Israelite, then we cannot have a meaningful conversation with Dante Fortson about who it may be or may not be an Israelite. It's that simple. As I say, clear writing requires clear thinking. If his reasoning is not clear, then we can't meaningfully address his arguments, because his arguments are vague at this point, and they've been vague for years. On that note, I look forward to the comments of others, especially supporters of Dante Fortson, people who think they know Dante's position, and or even critics of Dante's position, or what they think might be critics of Dante's position. And most of all, I would love to hear from Dante himself. He's always welcome to comment on my videos. I would never censor him if he did. I don't censor anyone, so he's always welcome to comment here. Or he can just make a video or some sort of Facebook post or social media post or whatever in response. Although, from past experience with Dante, I must confess, forgive me, but I must confess, I get the impression that he's likely to not address these questions, and he's likely to try to change the subject to something else. Whatever the case, we'll see.
Hey, so what's going on, 93, man? I know you got a lot of good information out there, but I'm gonna let you introduce yourself to the audience. Let them know who you are, what you about.
Hey, peace. My name is 93. Yes, I'm a black man because I've been listening to these dialogues, and I know that brother Dante, he's been wanting at least somebody of his own ethnic group to talk. I'm just an independent researcher who just wanted to chime in on something that I seen was inconsistent in one of the claims of Dante Fortson. I've been interested in this topic for a long time, and I'm trying to take a non-biased approach to the research. And I came across Brother Dante's website, and the topic of the Sephardic Jews is very interesting. I think it's very interesting of the ethnic claims. People saying that they're black, or some people saying they're brown skin. And I have seen an entry on his site that I just, I fact checked one of the sources, and it seems like there's some incorrect information. I don't know if Dante is aware of this, but I just wanted to present this, to see what he might think, of if he might want to indulge. I know, people have been wanting to dialogue with him, so maybe he'll take a different approach if, somebody like me bring this to his attention. So I'm presenting right now. I went to his site.
Go ahead and put this on the screen.
Yeah. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep.
Yeah, so basically I'm here on Dante Fortson's website, Black History in the Bible, and I went to an entry that he has pertaining to the Sephardic Jews. This entry is from August 8th, 2018, and it says late 1400s, Hebrews confirmed as black and on the west coast of Africa. And I'm just gonna go through it. It's a small article. Dante does a good job of condensing his claims and his information. He says here, this piece of evidence is the smoking gun. It's only a couple of paragraphs, but it fills in a great deal of information that we've been missing. It is found in the Nautical Magazine, a journal of papers on subjects connected. This is volume 39 of the Nautical Magazine. If you go here, I believe this book is from the 19th century, the 1800s, I want to say. But just using this website, he quotes this Nautical Magazine, volume 39, in the 19th century, and it makes a reference to another author who claims, who speaks about Jews in West Africa. So this Nautical Magazine says, Barbeau states that in the reign of Don John II and about the close of the 15th century, large numbers of Jews were expelled from Portugal and taken to the coast of southern Guinea, that the island of St. Thomas, which is not more than 100 miles from the mainland, was populated by mulattoes, descended from the Jewish exiles and Anglo women. I'm gonna stop right there. This is very important, actually, because he's saying that these Jews came to Africa and created mulattoes who are living on the island of, they call it Sao Tome or St. Thomas, excuse me. It goes on to say more about Jews in Angola and different people, and but I want to focus on what Dante zeroed in on. He's showing a map here of Guinea, Senegambia, what we know as Senegambia, Guinea, this coast here. And he talks about the Hebrews, the people, because he wants to focus on how the Hebrews are black. So focusing on mulattoes, mulattoes, they're descendants of two different races, usually black and white. So let's see what Dante has to say about mulatto Hebrews in West Africa. He says the descendants of the Jews living in Sao Tome and Principe are described as mulatto, If you're not familiar with the term, it is a term used to describe a person mixed with black and white. Many people find the term to be offensive. However, it is a major piece of evidence because the writer points out that the women were Anglo, meaning white. When he says Anglo, he's referencing Anglo-Saxons. Those will be the people of Britain and so forth. So he is saying that he gets out of this that the women were white because it says Anglo here. By process of elimination, it means that the Jewish men spoken of in the text were black. This is important because a lot of Hebrew Israelites, well, a certain amount of them, they maintain that the Anglo-Saxons were black. So here, if Dante Fortson is taking a stance or interpreting this as saying Anglo meaning white, if he's trusting this source, then this would mean for this to be true, he has to disagree with the notion that Anglo-Saxons are black. Furthermore, he is trusting the veracity of this author to have made this post. He have to have believed, at least given some credit to the Nautical magazine. So this would be a secondary source, however, because the source itself is referencing this man Barbeau. So I wanted to see what the author said himself out of his own mouth. And when I looked up or did some research, this Barbeau actually is Jean Barbeau. So I just did a little investigation. It took me here, various other sites, but I chose this to give you a background on who Jean Barbeau was. It says, Jean Barbeau, a Frenchman, served for several years as an agent of the French Royal African Company. And that's important because this is the French Royal African Company. The Royal African Company, the English Royal African Company, they were known for King James, his descendants actually engaging and orchestrating and dealing with the transatlantic slave trade. So Jean Barbeau he's involved in the French Royal African Company. So it says in that capacity, he made at least 2 slaving voyages to West Africa. So this man is a slaver, but he's an author also. So this is important to know. This is a man who sold these slaves. So he should have some kind of intel on the topic. So it says one, he made a voyage in 1678, the other in 1682. He published an account of his trips in 1682 in France. The illustrations below appeared in the 1732 translation of his text, a description of the coast of North and South Guinea. So this is some of the illustrations he made. His book is The Descriptions of the Coast of North and South Guinea. And this is Jean Barbeau's work. So I tracked down the author's original work, and I have some excerpts here that may juxtapose some of the claims that Dante has made in his post. So I just want to go here. This is page 403. And I think this is very important. Know or interesting to people who want to know about the Sephardic Jews. It says the blacks, both freemen and slaves, call themselves Cristianos Novos, that is, new Christians or converts. And many of them, as well as the mulattoes, are brought over from Brazil and Angola, besides the natives of the island who all speak Portuguese. So the reason I brought this up is to be fair, because I know if anybody actually went to this text, they would probably look at this and say, well, the blacks are the new Christians, because new Christians is also like a term for Jewish converts to Christianity, Jews who kept their Judaism secret. You have black people here, they're all called Cristianos Novos, because some of the inhabitants of Africa, they were brought to the Senegambian coast, or just on the mainland themselves, they came across the Portuguese, and some of them they converted to Christianity, and this is what they were called. Some of them were free, some of them were slaves. Some of them were brought from Brazil and Angola, actually, back over into Africa, and they lived there, and they were known by this title. So just in case, anybody want to know, yes, there were black people that were Cristianos Novos, not just Jews or any other people living there that may not have been black. So I go to page same book, Barbeau. I'm going to page 404. And when I read down here, it speaks about Sao Tome, and it might speak about the Jews and the mulattoes. Here it says, the first design of settling there, this is Sao Tome, was in the year 1486. But perceiving how many perished in that attempt by reason of the unwholesomeness of the air, and that they could better agree with that of the continent on the coast of Guinea. I'm sorry, this is an old book. It was resolved in council by King John of Portugal that all the Jews within his dominions, which were vastly numerous, should be obliged to receive baptism, or upon refusal be transported to the coast of Guinea. Accordingly, an edict was set forth, and many of those who would not comply were shipped off and set ashore in Guinea, where the Portuguese had already several considerable settlements and a good trade. Considering the time since the first discovery, a few years after, such of those Jews as had escaped the malignant air were forced away to this Isle of Saint Tome, or Saint Thomas. There married to black women fetched from Angola in great numbers, with near 3,000 men of the same country. From those Jews married to black women, in process of time proceeded mostly that brood of mulattoes, at this day inhabiting the island. So here, instead of Anglo, we see it's a misnomer for Angola. And we hear—
read that one more time, please, for the audience.
I got you. A few years after, such of those Jews as had escaped the malignant air were forced away to this Isle of Saint Tome. There married to black women fetched from Angola in great numbers, with near 3,000 men of the same country. From those Jews married to black women, in process of time proceeded mostly that brood of mulattoes, at this day inhabiting the island. So at this time, you have mulattoes who Barbeau is actually saying descending from black women and those Jewish men, who creates the mulattoes. So Dante, let's go back to what he was saying. His interpretation was that these mulattoes came from Jewish men and white women. He said the descendants there are mulatto. If you're not familiar, it's a person of mixed black and white race. He said the major piece of evidence is the writer points out that the women were Anglo, when actuality, if you go to the source, it says black women fetched from Angola. So what we have here is, one, the actual source that he uses is quoting the primary source, which Dante should have went to instead of using a secondary source. And he would have seen that his interpretation was actually the exact opposite. Instead of it being black men and white, seems to be white men, white male Jews, and black women from Angola, who produce a mulatto class there. And I have another portion.
So in other words, the secondary source is misquoting the primary source.
Absolutely.
Or at the very least, it's an error. At the very least, to grant the secondary source the benefit of the doubt, there could have been a typo in the secondary source quoting the primary source. Because when we look at the primary source actually has Angola or Angolan women rather than Anglo women.
Yes, or maybe at some point Anglo was short for Angola back then, and they just dropped that at some point. But I mean, it would make a lot more sense than, for one, British people just donating their women to Iberian people. Like, these men that's being banished here, they're banished. They're lowlifes in the eyes of Europeans. So why would they grant them with their women? You know, doesn't make sense for the Anglo-Saxons to contribute in any way, especially if you think the Anglo-Saxons are black, which I don't think Dante does. Either way, it doesn't make sense.
I want the audience out there to catch something. If mulatto means black and white, according to Dante Fortson's own criteria, if mulatto means black and white, and we see here that the women are being identified as black, that only leaves one possible conclusion. Again, according to his criteria, if the women are black, the men are...
They're white. As a matter of fact, for those interested in genetics, if you look up the genetics of the people of Cape Verde, you'll see a great admixture, and you'll see a lot of the male Y DNA haplogroups pointing back to Europe and places like Spain. They have that Jewish ancestry actually. Yep, they actually do. As a matter of fact, these people were called the Lancados actually, and that's a whole nother video to deal with. But the Lancados were very important in the Senegambian coast. I just want to go to another portion of this book before I use another source to supplement this claim of mulattoes in West Africa, mulatto Jews. I want to go to page 408 in Barbeau's book, where he talks about Sao Tome, the island. He says, the islanders are a mongrel people. As I have already hinted, white Portuguese descended from the first inhabitants of the island, pause, when it was settled. And he has Portuguese mulattoes also descended from the proscribed Jews sent thither at the beginning of the colony and married to black women sent from Angola. So we have this again, Angola, both free, besides a vast number of blacks and mulattoes not free. Transported also from Luanda de Sao Paulo, and the island could be cultivated. Well, yeah, it also talks about different other people the more you go down. But
if I could chime in very quickly, there was another section in the book. I think it was the Lemaire book that talks about the women, and it uses a specific term. Right? Oh,
yeah,
it uses a specific term.
Yes, I have. That's my next actual source I wanted to go to. But to go over this again, this here in this book says that the Jews sent thither at the beginning of the colony married to black women sent from Angola. And it talks about the Portuguese mulattoes. See here? Portuguese mulattoes also descended from the proscribed Jews sent there at the beginning of the colony and married to black women. So these mulattoes are the descendants of Jews and black women. This book here, I have it right here. You can see it up here, it's the title of the book, The Voyage of Sieur Lemaire and the Canary Islands, Cape Verde, Senegal, and Gambia. So this is the Senegambian coast. And he also, I guess, went to the Canary Islands. Here, he is describing various peoples who he's seen. So he has the Gelofs or Gelofs. This is in Senegal. Anybody know the word Gelofs or Gelofs or Jollof rice? He talks about the Sorare. He talks about the kingdom of Barbans. But here's where I want to put my focus. Right here he says, besides these three nations, and there is another, who are a sort of Portuguese, a nation who named themselves so because they were formerly subject to them, and are descended from those who first inhabited this coast. After the discovery of it, from the negresses whom they married were born the mulattoes, from whom are descended a more swarthy race. They may also be fugitives too of Cape Verde, or I think this says Cacbo, another colony of this nation, on one of the branches of the river Gambia, distance thence 3 days' journey, as they have followed the religion of their old masters. They are partly Jews and partly Catholics. They wear a coat like our chanteurs. No one is greater than another. Okay, and I'm gonna repeat that again for people that's, for everybody that's listening.
Right.
He said, besides the three nations listed above, there's another who are a sort of Portuguese, a nation who named themselves so because they were formerly subject to them and are descended from those who first inhabited this coast after the discovery of it. From the negresses whom they married were born the mulattoes, from whom are descended a more swarthy race. It says, as they have followed the religion of their old masters, they are partly Jews and partly Catholics. So here, even in this source, in Lemaire's source, in the 17th century, we see mulattoes on the Senegambian coast who are partly Jews, partly Catholic, and I'm sure they had some part paganism. I would assert that every time you see European explorers, or most times you see the European explorers coming to that coast, anytime after the Spanish or Portuguese Inquisition, they are running into the same people. They're running into these brown-skinned people who were mulattoes and maybe over time got even darker, and they kept part of their Jewish heritage. They are the descendants of white men from these sources and black women. We see it. It says negresses. That is the term for female black women. And we have also in the previous source, Angolan women who create mulattoes with these Sephardic Jews. So this actually is in stark contrast to Dante's findings. And I want to bring this to his attention. I don't know if he knows this. I don't know if anybody else has tried to bring this to his attention or have they successfully got his attention. But his entry, or at least in this instance, what he's saying about the ethnicity of the Sephardic Jews, it's in question. It's actually, I would say, it's been refuted by historical sources that maybe he needed to dig deeper into to find this out. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely refuted, man. Absolutely, positively debunked.
The prophecy. 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 Prophecy.
Prophecy. Prophecy caused all this trouble.
That prophecy?
Yes.
Greetings. Last October, Berean TV hosted a debate between Vocab Malone and Dante Fortson on the subject of the American 400-year prophecy, or as I like to call it, the Amerocentric or even US-centric interpretation of the 400-year prophecy, which is to say the belief that Genesis 15 verses 13 and 14 are referring to the African diaspora in the Americas. And with all due respect to Dante, much of his position remained unclear in that debate. You know, the finer details remained obscure. He often alluded to things, you know, that others believed without clarifying to what extent he may or may not have agreed with them. And he touched on a variety of subjects that didn't seem terribly relevant to the topic. And at one point, even he seemed to remark that the presentation hadn't yet gotten to the subject of the debate, the actual subject.
And I know I'm not getting to the 400 years as quickly as you guys want to.
All we want is that prophecy.
What's interesting about Dante's approach is that he feels the proper understanding of the 400-year prophecy relates directly to his attempts to identify who the Israelites are. But it seems that there's a disconnect, however, insofar that his attempts to identify Israel wind up applying generally to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade and their descendants, which are spread across the Western Hemisphere. Yet his interpretation of the prophecy, on the other hand, winds up more narrowly being limited to the scope of the United States.
A prophecy that misread could have been.
This becomes clear when one notes that he begins the count of the 400 years in specifically the year 1619.
According to you, not everybody else, just Dante Fortson, when did the 400 years begin according to you?
I agree with Dr. Eric Mason that it began in 1619 when the first African slaves arrived in Jamestown. I agree with Dr. Mason on that.
The reason why starting the count at that year is problematic is because the transatlantic slave trade did not begin in 1619. For example, for an easy example, slaves were brought from Africa to what is now Brazil in the earliest years of the 1500s. And, you know, there's honestly a certain incongruence in connecting the prophecy to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade on the one hand, and then disregarding the entire first century of that slave trade on the other. If one wishes to more artificially limit the scope of the prophecy to just the United States, the objection still remains, as even the beginning of bringing slaves to the landmass that we now call the United States did not begin in 1619. I realize that it's popular to throw that year around, but it is very much an artificial start to the count, as slaves were brought to this land, to the the land that's now called the United States, in the early 1500s as well. And this has been pointed out to Dante. Permit me to share a few examples. A little over a week ago, Dante posted, to Facebook on a theme which he's touched on several times, where he takes some online news story he came across and shares it as yet more evidence that America is currently in the judgment period, which is to come after the 400 years. So I offered a comment sharing what I just mentioned, that neither the transatlantic slave trade nor the bringing of slaves to the landmass now called the United States began in 1619. Rather, both began in the early 1500s. Then I noted that, hypothetically speaking, if one started the count in the early 1500s, one living in the early 1900s could have similarly cited the Great Depression as among the arbitrary signs of judgment. And I'll add now that, depending on where precisely one starts to count, one might have conceivably also included anything from the Spanish flu pandemic to the Dust Bowl to either of the first two world wars, maybe even the attack on Pearl Harbor. So this raises a question. How did Dante respond to that objection? Well, rather than attempt to address the central chronological issue, he merely attempted to change the subject, replying with the following, quote, "How about you focus on disproving that church's claim that there's language on those pews, since you said there is none, and so far we've seen people say Ge'ez, cursive Hebrew, and Arabic. Either disprove all of it or take the L," end quote. By the way, a quick side note, I may indeed make more videos on the subject of the pews, and if I do so, and one wonders aloud why I'm quote-unquote beating a dead horse, I may note that, no less a person than Dante Fortson encouraged me to return to the subject of the pews. But putting that aside and getting back to the subject of this video, I want to make a quick comment on the practice of this practice of reaching for popular stories on the internet in a seemingly arbitrary fashion. In Dante's debate with Vocab, he ran through a number of things along those lines, a number of things that he felt pointed to the post-400-year judgment. And in perhaps the most glaring example of how such reflected his social media experience, he even brought up quote-unquote murder hornets.
He wants you to believe the murder hornets were coincidence.
Returning to Facebook, a couple days later, another gentleman posted some similar objections to the US-centric interpretation of the 400-year prophecy, and Dante was invited to comment. Once again, he did not address the central objection. Instead, he noted that others, including government agencies, have put emphasis on 1619. However, that doesn't escape the fact that such a starting point remains artificial. It's not the actual start for either the transatlantic slave trade or even slavery in the land now called the United States. Citing 1619 may be popular, but it's still artificial. In still another Facebook post, another gentleman who is apparently a proponent of this interpretation of the prophecy made the same sort of appeal to governmental, affirmation of the significance of the year 1619, though in this case he was citing something that was, at the state level, for specifically Virginia. But whatever the case, in the comments section, Dante claimed that skeptics of his interpretation of the prophecy are quote-unquote silent. So I attempted to again remind him of the objection, which he's seemingly not yet addressed. And how did Dante respond this time? Well, in keeping with a now familiar pattern, he once again tried to change the subject, replying as follows, quote, "It's been pointed out that you worship Mary and other dead people. Don't tell me shit about black history, especially when the convo is clearly way above your head. You need to worry about debunking there being Arab on those pews," end quote. I'm not sure what to say at this point. I mean, honestly, it's I really am honestly not sure what to say, except that it seems that Dante is unwilling to meaningfully grapple with the objections presented to his position. And I'll add that these sorts of responses are frankly, they're in keeping with a trend which was covered in a previous video of mine from a few months ago titled Just Ask Dante. Now, before I close this video, it's worth noting that Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s new book, The Black Church, has a passage which is relevant to this topic, and thus which I'd like to read here. Gates writes the following, quote, "We tend to forget that the first enslaved Africans actually arrived in North America long before the much celebrated 1619 arrival of the 20 and odd Negroes from the Kingdom of Ndongo in modern Angola at Port Comfort on Hampton Roads at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. Enslaved Africans had been living in the Spanish colony of Florida at least since 1526, when they were taken as laborers to the failed Spanish colony of San Miguel del Hualdape, near Sapelo Island, off the coast of Georgia. Other enslaved Africans followed in 1528, 1539, and 1565, when the first Africans arrived at St. Augustine." End quote. In short, it doesn't matter how popular it is to invoke 1619. That year still does not mark the actual start to slavery in the land now called the United States. If one is going to apply the 400-year prophecy to slavery in this land that's now called the United States, they should start the count in the early 1500s. But that would then have the end come in the early 1900s. And it's interesting that proponents of the Amerocentric interpretation of the 400-year prophecy tacitly acknowledge that the end of the 400 years coming in the early 1900s would be problematic, So now, regarding these various adjustments, like saying it's not referring to slavery in the Western Hemisphere, but rather only slavery in the United States, or maybe only part of the United States, or maybe only the United States under the rule of English speakers, etc. All of that comes off as ad hoc limitations to avoid the obvious chronological problems with the interpretation.
So it looks like in this case, what we're doing is that we're cutting the foot to fit the shoe.
And this raises another question. And this is the question I'll close it out with. Is the Amerocentric interpretation of the 400-year prophecy falsifiable? In other words, is there any meaningful, reasonable condition under which proponents will concede that their interpretation was mistaken? How many years have to pass before they conclude they were wrong? Maybe another 5 years, maybe more? Will they ever tell us this? Or will they never share that detail with us and prefer instead to keep the concept perpetually vague so as to more easily readjust it at times, as the years move on farther and farther away from 2019? Food for thought.
But y'all came on my channel with a 400-year false prophecy. The 400-year prophecy is nonsense. Dante ain't give faithful or vocab that work with that 400-year prophecy. This is what it is. Listen, I'm going to tell y'all, if y'all know history, y'all reading the book wrong. I ain't saying y'all wrong in everything, but y'all wrong with that 400-year prophecy. This is just what it is. Tell us when the 400 years is supposed to begin. Y'all ain't articulating nothing. Y'all reading.
Greetings. For some time now, a number of controversies have been brewing between, on the one hand, Christian apologists who focus on Hebrew Israelites, and on the other hand, persons who sometimes are referred to as moderate Israelites. In the former group are people like, for example, Vocab Malone, Eric Mason, Faithful to God, and others. In the latter group, there are folks like Dante Fortson, among others. I mention Mr. Fortson in particular because this video will be focusing on him in this case. Now, from the little I've seen, the exchanges between these two groups often seem quite bitter, and the videos produced by each side are often multiple hours long. I've generally steered clear of such discussions, mostly because they're on subjects that aren't really of interest to me. For those who don't know, when it pertains to Israelite-related topics, I'm currently most interested in the Hebrew language and also the history of One West, and those two subjects don't seem to come up much in this ongoing series of controversies between Christian apologists and moderate Israelites, as they're called. However, one trend that I've noticed is a tendency to assume the worst when trying to interpret available bits of evidence, and I'm going to be touching on that in this video. Nonetheless, whatever the case, I recently saw some posts on Facebook from Dante Fortson on a subject I'm familiar with, and for that reason I wanted to make this short video. Earlier this evening, I saw this Facebook post from Dante Fortson, which read as follows. Eric Mason, why didn't you call out Cab Malone for writing a slavery parody, a quote-unquote whole song, as he says out of his own mouth, and then asking a black man to sing it for his amusement? Didn't your book mention confronting racism? Let's see you confront that racism within your own organization, or at least tell us what you personally find funny and Christ-like about slavery. You are being held accountable. And at the end of that post, he shared this video from March of 2018 titled Vocab Malone and Jay the Producer Think Slavery is Funny. That's a rather heavy charge, and therefore I'd like to show a relevant excerpt from the video which he shared. Here we go.
Right now, but check it out. I wrote a parody to something, bro. I think that this thing's hilarious. I'm gonna see if you're down to do it, and I'm gonna make a video out of this joint. You know that song by Miley Cyrus, Party in the USA?
Yeah.
Yo, slavery in the USA, bro. Slavery in the USA, bro. Slavery in the USA, bro.
Oh man,
I got a whole song, man, and I can't sing it.
Talk about that one off air.
So Dante Fortson, among others, assumed that in that clip, Vocab Malone was mocking the history of slavery which had happened in the United States. And on a certain level, I can understand how one might reach that conclusion when looking at that clip in a vacuum. However, I have some personal insight into this, as I know the story behind what Vocab was referring to, precisely because around that time in early 2018, he had discussed his idea about the parody with different people. And it turns out that he was not referring to the slavery which had already happened in the United States from the 17th to 19th centuries. Rather, he was referring to a hypothetical or fantasized future slavery which exists within the eschatology of certain One West groups. You see, Vocab Malone, among other Christian apologists who deal with Israelites, has often been told by certain One Westers that in the future he's going to be their slave. And it's that sort of future One Wester, UPKer, eschatological slavery in America that he was talking about writing a parody of. One would understand what Vocab was actually referring to if they saw the actual parody video, which came out a few months later, in the summer of 2018. So I'd like to play a relevant clip from that video.
Free is coming to America. That's right. And you, black man, you gonna own slaves. That's right. You, Hispanic man and Native Indian man, you are going to own slaves. That's right. You are gonna make them pick your cotton. That's right. You are gonna make them shine your shoes. That's right. You're gonna make them mop your floor. Right. And you are gonna work them like dogs. That's right. It's into God's people, man.
So put your pants up, 2,000 down soon. I'm gonna fly to the moon. I'm grabbing your girls like girl, lashing the waist like girl. So put your pants up, 2,000 down soon. I'm gonna fly to the moon. Yeah, it's a party in the UPK. Yeah, it's a party in the UPK.
So I would hope that it's obvious from that clip what sort of slavery in America he was talking about writing a parody of. He was writing a parody of the sort of slavery which certain One West groups fantasize about, and you may notice that he himself, or a depiction or caricature of himself, appeared in the sort of cartoon of that video, where he's depicted as a slave of one of the members of one of these One West groups. However, Dante Fortson was not impressed when this was presented to him, and he argued that the way it turned out in the video was sort of a cleaned up version, that he sort of diverged from what his original idea was. In short, Dante Fortson is assuming the worst. He's assuming still that Vocab must have been initially intended to mock the actual history of slavery in the United States, which took place prior to the 20th century, and not that he intended to refer to the sort of imaginary future slavery that certain groups hope for and dream of. Therefore, I'd like to turn to an old post in Vocab's own Facebook forum. So I'm going to hit the search key here, and I'm going to type in Cab Malone, which is Vocab's handle on Facebook, and I'm also going to put slavery and parody. And we'll do a search for these terms within his Facebook forum. So the post that I want to go to is this one, also from March of 2018. So I'll zoom in on the date here so you can see this. Notice it's March 24th of 2018. It was right around the same time. It's actually before the video that Dante Fortson appealed to. So Vocab there wrote, ISUPK hypocrisy alert. They claim the title of my upcoming parody video should have been Slavery in the Kingdom of Heaven because their doctrine is not about slavery in America. Well, here's a UPK false teacher at camp yelling, quote, slavery is coming to America, end quote. Oops, UPK messed up yet again. Don't worry, though, now I'm going to change the song title to Slavery in the UPK, parody of Party in the USA, instead. So to recap, regarding Vocab talking about writing a parody titled Slavery in the USA, there are two possibilities. The first is what I propose, which is that he was referring to the future slavery of UPK eschatology. The other possibility is what Dante Fortson and others assume, is that he was referring to the slavery which had actually already happened in the United States prior to the 20th century. So here are the reasons at the top of your screen to think that Vocab meant the future slavery of UPK eschatology. Number one, there's my own personal insight. I actually spoke to him about this subject in early 2018, so I know what he intended. But if you don't trust my word on that, a second reason is the actual parody video itself. There are depictions of slavery in that video, and they are the sort of slavery that exists within the fantasies of certain one-Westers, a future slavery that is part of their eschatology, in which people like Vocab Malone are their slaves. And then third, there's the explanation that Vocab gave back then in March of 2018, which we just looked at in an old post in his Facebook forum. So conversely, what are the reasons to think that the other possibility is the case, that Vocab was actually talking about mocking the slavery in America that existed prior to the 20th century? Well, honestly, it seems all there is are less than charitable assumptions. And that's why I said that a trend that I see in these bitter disagreements between Christian apologists and the what are called the moderate Hebrew Israelites, a trend that I see is assuming the worst. You know, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to Dante Fortson, but I think he didn't have any particular insight. Neither he nor other people who took this approach had any particular insight into Vocab's mindset, but they immediately opted for assuming the worst, when really, if one takes their time to look at what Vocab meant, they can see that he did not mean what they assumed he meant. I hope it has some value for others. At the very least, I figured the video could be pointed to if this polemic ever arises again. Greetings. A little over a week ago, Dante Fortson had a somewhat curious thread on Facebook, which struck me as interesting enough to share and make a short video on. And so the thread began with him sharing a post from Michael Heiser and offering the comment that you see at the top of your screen. Quote, "The book of Enoch says the children of angels had white skin. Is Heiser lying about Enoch or not?" End quote. Dante Fortson's allusion to the possibility that Heiser might be lying about something can pique one's curiosity, and therefore it's worthwhile to take a look at this post from Michael Heiser, which Dante Fortson shared. It begins with an image which has a quote within it, which reads as follows, quote, "I don't consider the book of 1st Enoch to be inspired and canonical, but that is no excuse for neglecting it in the study of Scripture," end quote. The statement within that image was actually an excerpt from the caption of the image, which I'd like to read now in its entirety, if you'll forgive a tiny bit of redundancy. The caption reads, quote, A book that isn't considered inspired by most of Christianity, many are told, isn't valuable for biblical understanding. Consequently, unlike Peter and Jude, whose New Testament contributions show a close knowledge of 1st Enoch, many Christians not only never read 1st Enoch, but are discouraged from doing so. I don't consider the book of 1st Enoch to be inspired and canonical, but that is no excuse for neglecting it in the study of Scripture. Frankly, this entire book is testimony to the folly of this inattention. End quote. Now, that seems pretty uncontroversial, and therefore, unsurprisingly, in the comments section, a gentleman named Jephthah asked the question that several might have had in mind. As you see at the top of the screen, where is the lie about Enoch, Dante? And Dante Fortson responded in his usual polite and cordial way, stating the following: "What lie? I asked a question. Do you people not know what question marks are? Now I see why y'all so dumb and blind that you were following an angel worshiper." At that point, I shared that I too was interested in the unstated reasoning of his post and added that clear writing requires clear thinking. Fortunately, Dante Fortson found it in the kindness of his heart to attempt to share a bit more of his reasoning. He wrote the following, quote, "Did he lie or not? If you read Enoch, you have to admit everyone on earth was not white before the flood. Enoch says the children of the angels, nephilim, were white," end quote. And then he proceeded to share a bit more, which is somewhat outside of the book of Enoch and is actually covered in a couple of videos he has on his channel. If we can summarize what we have so far just a bit, we can say we have Michael Heiser on one side, or Michael Heiser's post on one side, and then we have Dante Fortson or his post commenting on Heiser's post on the other. On the side of Heiser's post, we have the fact that he doesn't consider the book of Enoch to be canonical or inspired. However, a second point is that Heiser still thinks Enoch has value to biblical study. Meanwhile, on the other side, we have Dante Fortson's curious post, in which first he shares that he thinks that reading Enoch forces one to conclude that no one was quote-unquote white before the flood, and then second, in which Dante wants to ask if Heiser was lying about something. At this point, we should take a look at the relevant text in the book of Enoch, and depending on your edition, the text that Dante Fortson had in mind was either in the 105th chapter or the 106th. In this particular edition I'll be using, it's in the 106th chapter. And what the text is describing is the birth of Noah. Beginning at verse 2, it reads, "His body was white as snow and red as the bloom of a rose, and the hair of his head was white as wool, and his eyes beautiful. And when he opened his eyes, they illuminated the whole house like the sun, and the whole house became exceedingly light." Now, at this point, we should cover some apparent or potential misunderstandings on the part of Dante Fortson. First, he may have lost sight of the fact that Heiser explicitly said he did not consider this text inspired. Saying this text has relevant to biblical study doesn't mean that he needs to consider a particular part to be historical. Second, and more importantly, Heiser saying the text has relevance to biblical study does not mean that he's going to interpret the text the way that Dante Fortson does. Dante Fortson has a certain interpretation which I think is unjustified, and he seems to simply assume it as if it's a blunt fact, and therefore Heiser's interest in the text somehow must, entail incorporating Dante's interpretation of the text. And third, regarding Dante Fortson's interpretation of the text, he takes the word white in that passage and he filters it through a very American understanding, treating it as the way it's used in American settings as a quote-unquote racial or morphological category. However, when Dante Fortson uses the word quote-unquote white to refer to one of his fellow Americans, he's referring not to a person who is literally as white as snow, rather he's referring to someone who comes in a shade of pink or beige or maybe light brown. He's typically not referring to a person who has hair which is as white as wool, and he's definitely not referring to a person whose eyes glow to such an extent that it can illuminate an entire room. Without intending any disrespect to Dante Fortson, I must confess that I do wonder if he's ever read this text directly, or if he merely heard about it from others or read about it somewhere, and if he has read it directly, how closely he read it. Beyond that, I also have to confess that I find a certain amount of humor in at least the possibility that when Dante Fortson imagines the historical Noah as described in the Book of Enoch, he might imagine that perhaps Noah looked something like Vocab Malone. Anyway, all kidding aside, getting back to the text and Dante Fortson's assertion that Enoch states that no one was quote-unquote white before the flood, but the nephilim, the children of angels, were quote-unquote white, the text does state that Noah's look was somewhat unprecedented for human beings and did resemble the sons of angels. But again, the text is not describing a look that's typical of those fellow Americans of Dante Fortson, whom he refers to as quote-unquote white. Rather, it's referring to something that would even be out of the ordinary today, whether it be in America or Europe or anywhere else, where a person has skin that's white as snow, hair that's white as snow, and eyes that glow. But let's go a tad deeper on the quote-unquote whiteness of Noah according to the Book of Enoch. If you turn to the range of chapters from the 85th chapter to the 89th chapter, or depending on your edition, maybe from the 84th chapter to the 88th chapter, whatever, within that range of the second half of the chapters that are in the 80s, Enoch is quoted as recounting a vision he had, some rather metaphorical vision, but nonetheless a vision of not only Noah, but Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the progenitors of the tribes of Israel. So, beginning at 85:2 in this edition, it reads, Enoch began and said to his son Methuselah, "To thee, my son, I will speak. Hear my words, and lend thy ear to the vision of the dream of thy father. Before I took thy mother, Edna, I saw in a vision on my couch, and behold, a bullock came out of the earth, and this bullock was white." Now, the text goes on to have that white bull beget other white bulls, but for now, just keep that white bull in mind. Jumping to 87:2, Enoch is quoted as stating, "I again raised my eyes to heaven and saw in the vision, and behold, there came from heaven those who were like white men. One came out from that place, and three with him. And those three who came out last took me by the hand, and bore me away from the generations of the earth, and elevated me to a large place, and showed me a tower higher than the earth, and all the hills were lower." Now, regarding those four individuals who are described as white men, I would submit that those were angels. So this shows that it's not only the sons of angels that are white, described as white, but also it's the angels themselves are white. Now, I want to be careful to note that the text does not mean white in the American racial or morphological sense. It's not saying that these four angels looks like the Marx Brothers or something like that. Rather, the text is saying that they're literally white. Again, imagine white skin, white hair, glowing eyes. They were glowing. Anyway, jumping to chapter 89, as you see on the bottom of your screen here, the text goes on to state that one of those white angels went and taught a mystery to one of those aforementioned white bulls. Then the chapter goes on to state the following regarding Enoch's vision of that white bull. "He was born a bullock and became a man, and he made for himself a large vessel and lived in it. And 3 bullocks lived with him in that vessel, and it was covered over above them. And I again raised my eyes towards heaven, and saw a high roof, and 7 sluices to it. And those sluices emptied much water into a yard. And I saw again, and behold, fountains were opened on the earth, and in that great yard, and that water began to swell, and to be lifted above the land, and caused that yard to disappear, until all the land was covered with water." And now, jumping ahead to verse 7, it continues, "And again I saw in the vision till those sluices were put away from that high roof, and the fountains of the earth dried up, and other abysses were opened. Then the water began to run into these till the earth became uncovered. But that vessel reached the earth, and the darkness retreated, and it became light. But that white bullock, which had become a man, came out of that vessel, and the 3 bullocks with him. And one of the 3 bullocks was white, similar to that first bullock, and one of them was red like blood, and one was black." Now, at this point, I think it's obvious that this vision is referring to Noah and his 3 sons on the ark. the vision goes on to allude to the various offspring of Noah's 3 sons, and then verse 10, towards the end of verse 10, it states, and among them was born a white bullock. So it's referring to another white bull. And then slightly later in verse 11, it states, but that white bullock, which was born among them, begat a wild ass, and a white bullock with it. And the wild ass increased. But that bull, which was born from him, begat a black wild boar, and a white sheep. And this wild boar begat many boars, but that sheep produced 12 sheep. And when these 12 sheep had grown, they gave one of them to the asses, and these asses then gave that sheep to the wolves. And that sheep grew up among the wolves, and the Lord brought the 11 sheep to live with it, and to pasture with it among the wolves, and they increased, and became many herds of sheep, and the wolves began to fear and oppress them. For those who might not have immediately caught it, here's a quick key to the different people being symbolized in that vision, and you can go back and reread the text with this key in mind. Noah is depicted as a white bull. Abraham is depicted as a white bull. Ishmael is described as a wild ass. Isaac is described as a white bull. Esau is described as a black boar. Jacob is described as a white sheep, and then the Egyptians are described as wolves. Now, I fully understand that obviously these men weren't literally bulls or donkeys or sheep or boars or wolves, and therefore the text is metaphorical. I understand that, but it does raise an interesting question as to how metaphorical or how literal the color references are. And the reason why this is significant is because the text then goes on to describe Noah as literally white. And again, I don't mean like quote unquote white like you see many of Dante Fortson's fellow Americans, you know, who are actually beige or pink or light brown or something like that. I'm talking literally white like snow with glowing eyes. Now, it's also worth noting that if we're going to force Enoch to be the lens through which we view accepted biblical texts, it will wind up having a huge impact on how we understand that text in the first chapter of Revelation, which describes Christ in a sort of glorified state, which describes him as having not only his hair being white like snow and white like wool, but also his head separate from his hairs being white like snow and white like wool, and his eyes being like fire, and his feet being like metal that was burning in a furnace, and his face being like the sun. The overall depiction is of a person who is glowing. And so that description of Noah in the 105th or 106th chapter of Enoch, depending on your edition, would match up with that rather well. If the text of Enoch is the lens through which we interpret accepted or uncontroversially accepted canonically biblical text, then we could easily reach the conclusion that Revelation 1 is describing Christ in a glorified state, admittedly, but nonetheless describing Christ as literally white, glowing, just like his ancestor Noah was glowing when he was born. I know I covered a lot of text, but getting back to Dante Fortson's Facebook post from a little over a week ago, I feel he misunderstood both Heiser's post and especially the text of Enoch. However, one question which remains unanswered is what Dante was referring to when he asked if Heiser was lying. There were attempts to get him to clarify what he had in mind, but they were not very fruitful or successful. So I just want to share this last portion because I know that some feel that Dante is often unwilling to answer clarifying questions, but I think this might show that, with all due respect to Dante, perhaps sometimes the problem is he does not understand the question being posed to him. So he received fairly detailed replies from both me and Jephthah regarding Heiser and, the book of Enoch and all that. And he skipped over all of that. He skipped over those detailed replies on Heiser and Enoch, but he did respond as follows, quote, I asked a question. I never said he was lying. Do you have an answer to the question? I swear you all are dumb on purpose, end quote. At that point, it was once again pointed out that clear writing requires clear thinking, and then there was an attempt to clarify by noting that his question was vague and that he needs to clarify, is Heiser lying about what? He asks if he lies, but lying about what? And Dante's next reply read, quote, "My question is not vague. I asked, is he lying or not? It only requires a yes or no answer. Stuff only becomes vague when you all want to play stupid. Anyone with a brain knows a question mark indicates a question and not a declarative or imperative statement. I asked a yes or no question followed by a question mark. Not sure what isn't clear." And so yet another attempt was made to try to get Dante to clarify his question. He keeps asking if Heiser is lying, but he's failing to clarify what it is he thinks Heiser might be lying about. The question, is Heiser lying, begs a second question, lying about what? And Dante's only reply was to repeat the question, is Heiser lying or not? And of course that, in an attempt to be fair with him, once again, he was asked, lying about what? But it seems like he never got it. It just went on and on like that in that sort of circle. Is Heiser lying? Lying about what? Is he lying or not? Is he lying about what? Is he lying or not? You know, it was that sort of an exchange. It was quite frustrating for him as well, apparently, because eventually what happened was he started resorting to insults, quite disgusting insults. For example, you'll see here he posts a picture of a raccoon, a little cartoon raccoon, and then he employed these little raccoon emojis, which he intended as a rather gross racial slur. At that point, the thread had reached rock bottom, and there really wasn't much point in going on. In a sad bit of irony, in the recent past, Dante Fortson had railed against Vocab Malone's Private Eye for Yahushai skit, which satirized other Israelites, employing precisely the disgusting slur alluded to in that emoji. Those other Israelites employ that disgusting slur when people question them. And Dante thought that skit was outrageous, but now we see that he sinks to the same depths, employing basically the same disgusting language in a not-so-veiled way. It's honestly quite sad. Greetings. I must confess, I was unsure if I wanted to make this video, as the topic is, in my opinion, somewhat infantile. But I nonetheless figured ultimately that I should make this short video as part of an attempt to clear something up, just a bit anyway. What inspired this video is this YouTube community post which you see on your screen from Dante Fortson. He had shared a video by Faithful to God, and his caption introducing that video read in part as follows, quote, "This is what a pathetic has-been does, looking for out-of-context Facebook posts instead of asking me to clarify," end quote. So Dante is stating that Faithful to God could have and should have reached out to him for clarification on what was covered in the relevant video. And the video in question happens to be the one I narrated on the topic of Dante Fortson, Michael Heiser, and the Book of Enoch. The video itself received a comment along similar lines, presumably from a supporter of Fortson, perhaps a person who may have found the video after seeing Fortson's post, and the comment reads as follows, quote, "Why don't you ask Dante yourself what he thinks and believes and teaches? That is what I would do. I'm just saying," end quote. So just in case others agree, or just in case anyone else wants to tell us that we should reach out to Dante Fortson and ask him for clarification, I wanted to offer a couple of points which are worthy of note. First, as it applies to specifically the video in question, the request that we ask Dante for clarification is awkward because the last 3.5 minutes of the video show multiple attempts by multiple people to get Dante to clarify his line of thought, to no avail. I'd say he was unwilling to clarify his position, but I'm tempted to say he was unable to clarify his position. Whatever the case, more importantly is the fact that beyond that particular topic, beyond that particular video, we've made multiple attempts to initiate cordial correspondences with Dante Fortson, and he has consistently avoided such dialogue. So in this video, I'd like to show a few examples of such. Show a few examples of, attempts to get Dante to clarify certain positions he holds, attempts to ask him questions, attempt to initiate dialogue with him, and see how he responds. To begin, there's this Facebook post from March 23rd of this year. In that post, he presented two propositions which he had boiled down as significant from the sources that he had been consulting. First, that there were slaves who claimed to be Israelites, and second, that Judaism was quote-unquote native to West Africa, whatever that means. I assume he means that there were people in West Africa practicing some form of Judaism. Whatever the case, in the same post, he declared that none of the urban apologists had debunked these propositions. So I went ahead and wrote a reply to his post, which I suppose you can read here if you slow down the video or pause it at the relevant points, but I'll also share a link to the thread in the video description and people can look at it there at their leisure. In my reply, I asked some clarifying questions on what I felt were methodological points, and I also shared that one doesn't have to disagree with the propositions he presented, rather one can explore instead the line of thought that Fortson applies to those propositions or the conclusions that he infers from those propositions. So Fortson replied to my comment, but he didn't really engage my points. Perhaps he didn't understand them, and he didn't answer my clarifying questions. Moreover, he stated the following to me, quote, "I don't care about your input about the black community. None of your damn business. Go cause division in your own community and keep your nose out of ours." End quote. Then, on the 25th of March, so this is a thread that comes 2 days later, after the thread that we just looked at, he posted this new thread which reads as follows, quote, "We really need to start shutting down and ignoring anyone that isn't black when it comes to what we believe. Stay out of black business and focus on your own damn community. We don't owe you any answers or explanations, and we damn sure don't need your permission or approval. These non-black people in black business are the reason we have so much division. Always a non-black face trying to push division. Vocab Malone and his kind are the enemies of all black people, not just Israel." End quote. In short, there were attempts to cordially engage Fortson's reasoning, and that included asking clarifying questions, precisely what Fortson and at least one of his followers thinks we should reach out to him with. But when those clarifying questions were actually presented to him, he quickly put up these arbitrary morphological restrictions on answering those clarifying questions or queries about his reasoning or whatever. Here's another post from the 25th of March, which opens with the following statement from Fortson. Quote, "Shout out to Bro Berean for exposing the white money behind Eric Mason. I said that from day one. It was racist white money behind this resistance." End quote. Then he proceeds to share a photo of Vocab Malone, David Wood, and other friends of theirs in the Christian apologetic scene. The juxtaposition of his caption and the photo seemed to imply that those men in the photo were paying Eric Mason. So I asked a clarifying question. I wrote to Dante the following, quote, "Is this post meant to imply that one or more of the men in that photo are paying Eric Mason to take the positions he takes? If so, what is the evidence for such a claim?" End quote. And what was Fortson's reply? He replied as follows, quote, "Stay out of black business." End quote. So there you see again an attempt to ask a clarifying question, and then, immediately comes this arbitrary morphological, requirement to set up a barrier to dialogue to provide an excuse for why he shouldn't have to clarify his position. Anyway, moving on, late last October, in another Facebook thread started by a different gentleman, I had left a comment trying to discuss the preliminaries of one's methodology for determining who is or is not an Israelite, and Dante Fortson left a comment in my subthread, but in reply to someone else. So since he was there in the subthread, under a comment by me, I decided to represent to him the sort of basic methodological questions which I had presented to him in months prior. But, when I had presented these questions to him previously, it was to no avail. So I asked him if he believed that paternal lineage was the sole determining factor in who is or is not an Israelite. And I asked him if he believes a person's morphology allows us to determine their lineage across millennia. These are important questions because when you start dialoguing with Israelites beyond the One West spectrum, you occasionally meet folks who don't put as much emphasis on paternal lineage. And you meet folks who put a lot of emphasis on morphology. It's funny enough, just recently, Dante Fortson shared a video by Teo Ministries in which they basically insinuated that a person could descend paternally from Jacob, but if he has the wrong morphology, if he's quote unquote white, then his descent from Jacob becomes irrelevant. He can't be an Israelite. That was the insinuation. I may get into that at a later time. But anyway, in this instance, Fortson refused to answer those clarifying questions regarding his approach, and instead he responded as follows, quote, "Oh, you still think I owe you an answer or explanation concerning anything? Go find a black person to speak to me on your behalf," end quote. Recently, Dante Fortson has been declaring that the urban apologist will be, quote, over by the end of 2020, end quote. That's an interesting prediction, though it requires some clarification as to what precisely he means by that. Because if it turns out that, the people he considers urban apologists are still around in 2021 and 2022, then will his prediction have been wrong, or will he say, that's not what I meant? So there needs to be some clarification. When a different gentleman made a similar prediction on Facebook, I asked him, likewise, how he defined urban apologists. And pardon the language here, but Dante chimed in with this eloquent and mature reply. He defined urban apologists, or UA, as, quote, uneducated a-holes, end quote. And again, I ask that you pardon the language. Moreover, elsewhere in that thread, when Dante co-signed the other gentleman's post, I asked Dante to clarify what he meant by UA, by urban apologists. And once again, his reply was the same bit of profanity, and again, pardon the language, but there it is on your screen, uneducated a-holes. This level of profanity and vulgarity is the kind of quality of reply that you might get back when you ask Dante Fortson a clarifying question. Now, before I close, let me share one more example, and this one is my personal favorite. Late last October, Dante Fortson shared on Facebook a video in which he discussed the pews at First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia, with Pastor Kelly Richardson. And just to be clear, in the video, he makes clear that the primary focus was on those pews. Ironically, while the video is well over an hour long, not once do they attempt to look at any markings on the pews. But relevant to this discussion, I wound up being mentioned in the video. Here, take a look at this clip, which is just under a minute long.
Even to give clarity on the pews, because the reason why I'm offended by vocab alone, for example, his whole goal is to try to take everything that is identified with us and try to make it into a talking point to prove that, these are not the people of the book. See, they're trying to use this as they the Hebrew Israelite, all this other crazy stuff. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of things and knock down some of the lies that he put out there of taking me saying that I cannot read what's on the pews to saying that I can't read Hebrew and all this other stuff. And when I say I cannot read what's on the pews, I'm not the only one. Even his so-called person that brought him per se into the apologetics, Abu, made it clear that he can't read what's on the pews, and yet they're trying to say it's Arabic. So I want to just deal with that real quick.
Okay, so after watching the video, and especially with the part that mentioned me in mind, I went back to Fortson's Dante Fortson's Facebook thread in which he linked to that video. And I left a comment noting that it's awkward to discuss the pews for over an hour, yet not once actually take a look at the markings on those pews. And then I responded to what Kelly Richardson had said about me and about Arabic being on the pews. So what was Dante Fortson's reply? He wrote the following, quote, "You are not black. Stay out of black business and go deal with your own kind and the BS you all are teaching," end quote. That is my favorite example of how absurd this is, because here we have Dante Fortson putting up a video in which specifically I'm mentioned, and yet he still declares that it's not my business because I failed to meet some arbitrary morphological requirement. It's honestly hilarious. Man, it's also sad. Now, as I close this video, I suspect that some will want to respond that Dante doesn't have to talk to us if he doesn't want to. And my reply to that would be to say, okay, fine, I agree. Dante Fortson is certainly free to avoid corresponding with us. He can choose to abstain from answering our clarifying questions. But if that's the road he's going to go down, then it is awkward to encourage us to reach out to him. Moreover, him putting up posts declaring, or excuse me, actually complaining that someone allegedly didn't ask him to clarify something, it comes off as mere public theater when you view it against the backdrop of him spending months refusing to answer clarifying questions. You know, he's going to complain about someone not asking him to clarify something when when people have asked him to clarify things and he's refused to do so. He actually gets really frustrated when people do so. So in short, we have tried to initiate respectful correspondences with Dante Fortson. However, unfortunately, he has made clear that he prefers that we not correspond. For the most part, his only replies have been exhibitions of his own frustrations, evasions, and the profanity.
Character, or am I as vocab right now?
It can be vocab, that's fine.
Okay. What's up? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our debate. The topic today is Jesus God. Our two debaters are apologist Anthony Rogers. He'll be answering in the affirmative from the Christian perspective. I encourage you to check out his other debates on YouTube. And answering in the negative will be our Islamic apologist, Jamar Sadat, who will be taking his seat as soon as he is in character. That's myself, vocab, and then the Jamar Sadat character will give an alternative conclusion. With that, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together, please.